for some time, but at length reappeared on the opposite side of the sled to that which he had started from. " Are you there, Andreitch? " he shouted. " Yes," replied Vassili. " Well, what now? "" There is no getting out this way. It is too dark, and there are too many ravines about. We must try driving back against the wind." After doing so for a little while, they stopped, and Nikita once more alighted and went creeping about over the snow. Then he remounted, but only to alight again almost immediately, until at length he came to a halt by the sledge in a perfectly breathless condition. " Well, what? " inquired Vassili. " Only that I am fairly done, and the cob nearly so too." " What are we to do, then? "" Wait a minute." Nikita departed again, but returned in a moment or two. " Keep close behind me," he cried as he walked on before the cob. Vassili had now ceased to give orders, but humbly obeyed Nikita's directions. " This way, after me! " cried the latter again as he turned sharply to the right, and, taking Brownie by the head, led him downwards towards a snowdrift. The cob held back at first, and then made a plunge forward as though to leap the snowdrift. Failing in the attempt, he sank in up to the collar. " Get out of the sledge! " cried Nikita to Vassili, who had retained his seat meanwhile. Then, grasping one of the shafts, he exerted all his strength to help the cob drag the sledge out of the drift. " Pull, my pet! " he cried to Brownie. " One good pull and the thing is done. Now, now! Just one good pull! " The cob made a brave effort, and yet another, but, failing to extricate himself, settled down as though to reflect upon the situation. " Come, come, my pet, this won't do," Nikita adjured Brownie. " Now then, once again! " And he tugged at the shaft on his side, while Vassili tugged at the other. The cob shook his head for a moment, and then plunged forward suddenly in another attempt. " That's it! You're not going to be buried this time, eh? " cried Nikita encouragingly. Another plunge, a second, a third, and the cob had cleared the drift and stopped short, shaking himself all over and breathing heavily. Nikita was for dragging the sledge a little further yet, but Vassili was so exhausted with the weight of his two heavy coats that he gave up and climbed in again. " Let me rest a minute," he said, as he loosened the handkerchief which he had wound round his coat collar before leaving the village. " Very well, there is no great hurry," returned Nikita. " Sit still, and I will lead the cob." Accordingly, Vassili remained in the sledge, while Nikita led the animal forward for about 10 yards, down a slope, and then up again a little way, and finally came to a halt. The spot where he had done so was not actually in the ravine itself, where the snow blowing off the hillocks and accumulating might have buried them entirely, but in a spot partly sheltered by the lee side of the ravine. Occasionally the wind seemed to drop a little, but it was not for long. Whilst, as if to make up for such lulls, the blizzard would increase tenfold after they were over, and tear and swirl around the travellers more cruelly than ever. One of these violent gusts struck the sledge just as Vassili was descending from it to go take counsel with Nikita as to what they should do next, with the result that they could only cower down without speaking until the fury of the squall was spent. As for Brownie, he flattened his ears and shook his head in disgust. When the squall had abated a little, Nikita took off his mittens, tucked them into his belt, blew upon his hands, and set to work to unfasten the bow rein from the douga. " Why are you doing that? " asked Vassili. " Because there is nothing else to be done," replied Nikita, though half apologetically. " I am absolutely tired out now." " Then aren't we going to try and get any further? "" No, for we are only exhausting the cob for nothing," said Nikita, pointing to the animal, where it stood patiently waiting for what might be required of it, yet scarcely able to hold itself upright on its stout, sweat-belathered flanks. " Brownie is willing enough, but he can hardly stand on his legs. There is nothing for it but to spend the night here." Nikita said this as if he were proposing to put up in an inn-yard, and went on unfastening the collar thong until the two clasps of the collar fell apart. " But we shall freeze to death here! " cried Vassili. " Well, what if we do? It cannot be helped," was all that Nikita vouchsafed to reply. This ends Section 5.